All right, so if you're just here for a form video, I'm gonna hit play, we'll watch some reps. But if you're interested in setup tips and execution cues and all of that stuff, stick around afterwards. Okay, so let's talk about the execution. We're gonna talk about the setup afterwards, but when it comes to the execution of this exercise, we're gonna talk about two main things. The first thing is this idea of driving the arm down, not back. And we do so that we can better bias the lats in this movement versus some of the upper back musculature. And so when we are in this stretched position, what I am thinking about is driving my humerus or this upper arm, or for some of you guys, it might be helpful to think about your elbow, thinking about driving that down. And a good kind of mental cue for me is driving this down into my pocket here. Driving my elbow or my humerus down, not back. And so let's take a look at a couple reps with that in mind. Thinking about driving this elbow down. It will end up with a bit of a back component, but if you initiate with a downward intent, what's going to happen is you're actually going to end up, we'll pause it at the bottom here, you're actually going to end up with your arm somewhat in line with your torso at the end of the movement. You're not actually going to be pulling the elbow far back behind the body. So if we start with a downward intent, if we are pulling down and we don't end with our elbow back behind the body, you're doing great. Those are the two main things I want you to focus on. Driving the humerus, driving the arm down, and not letting it pass far behind the body. Now, let's talk about the setup, because that's going to be where most people get tripped up here. I think once you're set up in position, pulling down and not passing your body is the easier side of things. So let's talk about the setup here. What I'll do is I'll grab the cable, I'll set it, we'll talk about cable height in a second, but what I want you to do is I want you to set up here, which is actually a good setup for what's called a single arm lat pull down. What we are doing is a pull around. And so it's helpful to get into this position first and then transition to the around technique, which we'll kind of go over in depth in a second. So to set up for this technique here, what we want is our offhand pressed hard against the head of the bench for stability. We're going to want one of our knees up on the bench, 1 foot down. This is a really nice stable position that you can be very strong in. If you look at my arm position, my arm is out in front of the body, right? It's not directly over my head. You can tell very simply by just looking at me. My arm is out in front of my body somewhere. So make sure that the cable height reflects that. If the cable is super high and it's directly overhead, that kind of shoots this in the foot here. It becomes an exercise that doesn't really work the lats really well. In order to work the lats, we want the arm somewhere in front of the body. So make sure the cable height is set up low enough where your arm is in front of your body, not directly overhead. Now, once we are in this position, I want you to watch as I rotate towards my working arm, or in this case, towards the camera. Now, why are we doing this? Why are we doing a pull around and not just doing a pull down? Really simply, if we want to lengthen the lats, what we want to do is we want to wrap them around the rib cage. We want to take our arm and move it across the midline of our body. The lats use the rib cage for leverage, and as we move our arm across the body, they lengthen around the rib cage so we can challenge the lats in a more lengthened position. So what I want you to watch, and we're going to watch it several times, you don't need to catch it on the first run here, is as my hips, my knee, my foot, my torso, my shoulders start to turn towards my body. And what we're looking to do is get our arm across the midline of the body. And instead of taking the arm and moving it across the midline, we're actually going to just leave the arm and rotate the torso to accomplish essentially the same thing. So we'll watch it a couple times here. Cool. So we're starting here in a lat pull down technique, and we're going to rotate our hips. I like to rotate my feet, my shoulders, so that now I'm facing that working arm. Now I have turned my torso towards my working arm, and my arm is now coming across my body. So let's watch that one more time. Transition from this position, rotate, 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 rotate. Now my arm is coming across my body. Now, what I want you to watch is my arm real quick. So right now, while my arm is in front of my body, it's still quite overhead, right? It's still pretty high. As I rotate and my arm now comes across the midline of my body, that arm will actually come down a little bit. And you guys can kind of do this right here while you're watching the video. If you take your arm and you pull it all the way across the midline of your body as far as you can, and then you try and pick it up, you will hit a stopping point. And so what that is essentially you will lose the ability to put your arm overhead like you could do right here once you wrap around the rib cage. And so you'll see my arm actually get lower. And so we'll watch it and then we'll talk about it. See how that arm kind of goes down? This arm is much more across my body than it is overhead. It started out pretty much overhead, somewhat out in front, and as I rotate to have that arm kind of more across the midline of the body, I lose some of that upward flexion. Let's say I lose that arm overhead. That is okay. Let me be very clear. That is something that is just happening naturally. That is not something that you need to be trying to do. That will just happen. I'm just letting you know that that is okay. That is supposed to be happening. And so my arm is more overhead here than when my arm is now across the midline of my body. I will lose some of that upward flexion as I go across the body. And again, you guys can do this right here. If you pull your arm across the body and you try and go up, you won't get nearly as high as if your arm was here at your side, right? So that's gonna happen naturally. I don't want you guys to worry too much about it. So, quick recap. You're gonna set up in a single arm lat pull down technique here with one arm braced against the bench, one knee up, arm somewhere out in front of the body, which means you needed the cable to be low enough that it's not directly overhead. Then you're gonna rotate your shoulders, your hips, you can rotate your feet. I find that to be very helpful towards the working arm to put that arm now across the midline of the body so that we can lengthen the lats around the rib cage and challenge them in a more lengthened position. As you do that, your arm will come down because you will lose that ability to go more overhead as you go more across. From this position, we will focus on driving our humerus or our upper arm or our elbow, whichever thing works best for your brain, driving that down towards your pocket, not back like as if you were doing a row. If you do that correctly, you will end up with the upper arm in line with the torso, not driving that elbow far back behind the torso. All right, I know this is gonna be a new move for everybody, so please send a form video to the group. Let's talk about it. Looking forward to you guys giving it a shot.